I'm Jim Austin. I'm here with my father, James Henry Austin. What you're going to see is a conversation about his life. We're here in Columbia, Missouri for a conversation with James Henry Austin. Thank you for watching. Jim, who was the person most kindest to you?
Well, the person most kind to me was undoubtedly Roy Schwenk, MD, PhD. Roy gave me my first academic job at Oregon right after I finished my neurology residency at Boston City and at New York Neurological Institute. And he really showed me what a mentor should be like in academic medicine.
Jim, can you think of a few influential relatives in your life?
I can think of five relatives who were most influential, and I really need to start with my grandmother, Sophia Schreer, who is in this picture. Her nickname was Muzzy, and Muzzy was very important to me as a child. Muzzy was important because she showed me what it was like to be a mother of 6 kids in the early 1900s and to get 5 of them through a college education. She also showed me how crucial it was to plant and maintain a garden, including a vegetable garden, to feed all this brood of hers. Moreover, she gave her young grandson a particular artifact which I found weighing down the sauerkraut basin in the bathroom. It was a basalt Indian hatchet head, and this was what she had found somewhere in her farm in northern Ohio, where she grew up. And this is what went on to spark my early interest in archaeology and the rest of my Indian collection. The second person was a relative, not by blood, but by marriage, was Frank Scott Gibson. My Uncle Gibby was my Aunt Patsy's husband, and he exemplified the ultimate in what a compassionate general surgeon would be. He was chief of staff at Western Reserve Hospital in Cleveland, and he volunteered his services free to the small hospital in the small Ohio town of Lodi, where he grew up, and he did that at least monthly. He also took me when I was a young adolescent in my teens to scrub up with him in the operating room and watch him while he performed his thyroid and other operations. Uncle Gibby set the mark for me to be someone in the medical professions who was both skilled and compassionate.
So would you say it was not only his compassion and his skills, but also his presence that were a huge influence?
He was ready to listen carefully to every word that anybody said to him. He had a deep, resonant voice, and his presence alone was capable of holding your attention. The third person in the family who was important to me was his wife, Patsy Gibson, my Aunt Patsy. Patsy was important because she was a very loving nurse and exemplified what the best nurse would be. And I would see her every summer growing up on the farm she and Uncle Gibby had in northern Ohio. The fourth would be my grandfather, Judge James Austin Jr. The judge, and I'll show a picture of the judge, was an exemplary scholar, my father's father, and he was the first Austin to graduate who pointed the way to the rest of us to go to Brown University for our higher education. He took me by the hand when I was 6 years old so that I could meet and talk with his black neighbors and discuss things with them in their house. And he deliberately exposed me then as a young child to a non-discriminatory mode of relating to other people outside of my own family culture. He taught free at the University of Toledo Law School and donated his extensive law library to the Toledo University Law School.
Jim, could you share some of the deep friendships you've had in your life?
Well, I'd like to mention Cousin Austin Kiplinger, because he was the fifth person in the family who inspired me. Austin had a brilliant intellect and an outgoing personality, and he invited me later on to speak at his Washington, D.C. press club to talk about Zen Buddhism.
What was an example of his brilliance?
I invited Austin one time to talk at the University of Idaho to the business school. And he was their after-dinner speaker at a major conference. And without any notes, he delivered the most remarkable on-camera performance to the whole audience that I've ever witnessed. I think we should talk about item number 3, which are the 4 friendships outside the family. Well, the first would have to be Craig Moody. Craig was my fraternity brother at college. He was my roommate and my best buddy later for fishing in New England and hunting in Colorado. And he was the brother I never had growing up. So Craig Moody was my best buddy. The next friendship that was absolutely crucial was that with Norman Cousins. Norman Cousins was president of the World Association of World Federalists, and he was also the editor of the Saturday Review of Literature. He also happened to be Kennedy's go-between behind the scenes with Khrushchev and wrote some of the speeches that Kennedy had. I was inspired by the man. I was inspired by his editorials during the Cold War. This particular influence from this man inspired us to go to New Delhi for the sabbatical in 61 and 62 to help put on the first World Conference of World Federalists that year in New Delhi. This choice of being in India also helped me collaborate with Bill Bachawat in South India, and this made it possible for us to prove that patients could be diagnosed during life with metachromatic leukodystrophy, which had been possible only at death by examining the kidney and the brain for sulfatase A. So that this really made it possible, this work with Bimal in India made it possible to go on and devise a new diagnostic test for this disease. A third person who was very important to me was David Stump, MD, PhD. And this is a picture of David Stump when he became the chairman of neurology at Northwestern University Medical School. Dave started in my Oregon lab when he was a college student, and he then transplanted with us to the University of Colorado in Denver. He went on to discover that a separate disease, mucopolysaccharidosis type 6, was caused by a sulfatase B deficiency. And he then went on to a career in pediatric neurology to become the chairman of neurology at Northwestern. His growth from just being an ordinary MD, like I was, to being a professional PhD researcher demonstrated forcefully to me the value of a joint MD-PhD career path. And this went on later to determine my choice of establishing the MD-PhD program at Brown University, which would help younger generations of researchers go on. This program was named after my grandfather, the judge, who was in the class of 1880 at Brown.
And were there two other persons of major influence for you that you wanted to share?
Yes, there were. One of them was Raymond Adams. Ray Adams was the most inspiring teacher that I ever had, not only in medical school, but during my residency and during the rest of my life when I would be invited to speak in Denver, and would also play tennis with him. Ray demonstrated both clinical excellence and had extraordinary gifts, both as a neuropathologist and as a pediatric and muscle pathologist. He inspired another named endowment, this time for the American Brain Foundation at the American Academy of Neurology. And this was designed to support neurological research by young MD and PhD investigators.
What was another major person in your life?
Well, one of them was certainly Nanre Kobori Roshi. He was the abbot who accepted me for 8 months of Rinzai Zen training, lay training, at Ryokoen, a temple associated with Daitakuji in Kyoto during the sabbatical year 1974 to 1975. This channeled me and changed me from being an ordinary Unitarian into becoming a sort of Buddhatarian, and also toward becoming a daily morning Zen meditator for the next 47 years. So this was a significant change in another human being. What are the tangible results of this change? Well, they would include the 6 Zen Brain series of books from MIT Press, multiple articles, and teaching conferences around the globe. So I began then a second career after neurology, both before and during retirement. Kobori Roshi was both an exemplary English-speaking Zen master, with a smile, as you can see from the photograph, wider than his face, as he was described. And he was also a creative potter, a calligrapher, and an architect of his temple in Kyoto.
Jim, what was life like for you growing up?
Well, I'd say the biggest challenge that upset what I thought was reality was the time when I was in high school, about 14, when I developed severe pneumonia and was saved, really, by the introduction of sulfadiazine. So I was very sobered by this firsthand evidence that life was transitory and that it could end at any time. And this meant really a big career change. Before that, I resonated mostly with the idea of becoming an outdoor writer, but now a life spent in medicine and in service would take top priority. This was a big change. Growing up over the decades, I also developed several completely different hobbies that I found a very wonderful addition to neurology, which was ordinarily premised on the use of logic and anatomical diagnosis. And these hobbies included fishing, they included gardening. Gardening became very important, and it was initiated by my mother giving me some morning glory, black morning glory seeds to soak and plant in the soil and then watch them develop and flower. I somehow transplanted this metaphor into an interest in observing younger persons growing up and developing over the years.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your other hobbies?
Yes. Pottery was a major hobby. It started in 1949 when I finally had some time as a first-year neurology resident to stay awake during the day instead of being stressed out by 24 hours of being on call. And this continued not only in Kyoto, Japan, but also in Denver, Colorado for a number of years. And I used to donate some of my cups to my graduating residents from our residency training program. Another interesting hobby was dog racing and hunting with Brittany's, two Brittany's, and one golden retriever. Another hobby was watercolor painting. This began with adult classes, both in Portland and in Denver, and a number of outdoor scenes are still hanging on the walls of the current home here in Columbia. Tennis was a major hobby, a hobby I shared not only with Norman Cousins, but also with Ray Adams. I started in high school at the age of 13, and it has continued right up to the present weeks.
What practical coping strategies were useful?
Well, I had 5 from my mother. My mother's words still resonate and echo. Here's Buffy Holcamp Austin when she was 34 years old.
Tell me more about your mom.
Well, she taught me partner tolerance early. In words would go like this: if you're angry in marriage, never go to bed without making up, quote unquote. Quote, always look both ways before you cross the street. Quote, never underestimate the power of the written word. She demonstrated this first to me when I was a kid with The Microbe Hunters, a book by Paul de Cruyff, which in part was based on her ability to take up a laboratory technician job during the First World War. Quote, put yourself in the other person's moccasins. Get out of your own egocentric center, in short, and pay attention to somebody else's view of the world. And then, Jigs, we don't care what you become when you grow up. Just be a good one.
What was her nickname for you?
Jigs.
Jigs.
Jigs. My name for her was Muggs. So we had a Muggs and Jigs duo conversationally. Now my father, Paul Weber Austin, taught by example more than words. He taught me to be a careful, detailed, creative person by my work in literature, and his examples in literature, in music, and in art. And he's shown here both with my mother and my daughter Lynn in the center. He also showed me that it was not useful to get upset or discouraged, but to keep on trying new ways to solve problems. An important route into problem solving was what I learned on Buddhist meditation retreats. This would last anywhere from a day to a weekend to the 7-day annual retreat. And this taught me to endure mental and physical hardships and to accept the way things really are rather than know how I might want them to be otherwise. So I've learned to practice the self-discipline of a regular meditative routine. This meant daily morning calisthenics. It meant daily morning gratitude practice. It meant the daily morning Zen meditative periods of what turned out to last about 45 minutes each. I've also learned other solid habits in regular physical exercise, diet, sleeping, and in interpersonal relationships over the years, and they've been important.
And on the subject of your gratitude practice that you mentioned, who are you most grateful for in your life?
My 56 years of married, loving relationships with Judith St. Clair were most decisive in helping me grow up as an adult, from only starting as a bachelor to then becoming a husband, a father of 3, a grandfather, and now great-grandfather to Henry Harold Blank.
How does that feel?
That feels splendid. It has all of the joys associated with fatherhood and all of the detachments from all of the other stuff that's involved in raising a baby. My gratitude to Judith is memorialized in the endowed Judith Austin Fund at the University of Colorado Medical School.
And Jim, in your marriage, what are your happiest memories of being with Judy?
Well, my happiest memories in marriage to Judy were the shared joys that were associated with each of her pregnancies and with the birth of Scott Austin, Lynn Austin, and Jim Winslow Austin. A second one was the joy that was associated with the reunion that we finally could have when I rejoined her in San Francisco in 1951 after being separated from her for 6 months by service in Japan during the Korean War when I was loaned temporarily to the United States Army from the United States Naval Reserve. I should mention that my saddest memory was breaking down, shattered really, in tears when the stark reality of her Alzheimer's diagnosis finally struck home. I was driving the car at the time, and the radio was on, and it was playing the music from Camelot, being sung by Robert Goulet. And the tune was, "If Ever I Would Leave You." And the impact of this moment was such that I had to pull over to the side of the road and start the recovery process from this reality.
Looking back, what are your life's satisfactions?
Well, I'd say the first would be 3 good-hearted, intelligent, accomplished children, each one being completely different, and each contributing in their own ways to society and to the next younger generation. Next would be my own contributions as chairman, responsible for the clinical research, education, and financial obligations of the first Department of Neurology at the University of Colorado Medical School. In that role would be the selection and the training of some 60 MDs who would, like plants, grow into competent practitioners of the art and the science of neurology. And then there would be the publication at MIT Press of a Zen Brain series of books over the 19-year retirement period from 1998 to 2017, plus one second edition of Chase, Chance, and Creativity. And then finally there would be novel neurochemical discoveries in metachromatic and globoid leukodystrophy, in myoclonic epilepsy, known as Lafora's disease, in mucopolysaccharidosis type 6, with Dave Stumpf, known as Moreau-Lame's disease, and in the treatment of a separate disease known as recurrent polyneuropathy.
Jim, what are some times in your life when you felt most alone?
There were 3 times when my own life was at stake. The first, as I've mentioned, was when I was in the hospital at age 14 as a teenager in 1939 with pneumonia. The second occurred when I was 15 years old, when I was stuck in a swamp like quicksand, sinking into it while fishing at summer camp. And only with grit and luck did I extricate myself. The third time was somewhat similar in 1990 when I was swimming in the Pacific Ocean off Maui, and I was 65 at the time and was about 10 feet down from the surface and started to cough, and that took away most of my air and meant that I somehow had to reach the surface in order to survive. I felt very alone on each of these 3 occasions.
What Zen constructs are most reverberant for you?
I would say that construct is a useful phrase. What we're talking about is not a concept or anything that is highly cognitive, but it is a direct Zen experience of Kensho. And this occurred in London, England in 1982. It was most awesome in the deepest sense of the word awesome. Awesome would be felt in retrospect, but while this was going on, there was the physical experience and the whole psychic experience of witnessing the self vanish. And this experience of losing the self, both the physical and the psychic sense of self, is most extraordinary. And then also, all during this experience, to lose the sense of primal fear and to dwell in a sense of eternity is really beyond all words that are possible to use.
How has your life been different from what you imagined?
I've learned to regard the vagaries of life philosophically and evolutionarily, in the sense that I've learned to look at life in several different ways and from different perspectives. I've always been a biologist, and so one of the phrases that would describe it would go something like this: Life is what happens when chance helps redirecting your next destiny. And a second way is, when asked the question of what is the meaning of life, my response would be something like, well, life is. I really don't know what it means. I was so impressed with the way chance events had come in to intercept my previous sense of what life was, that I was inspired to write my first book about this phenomenon back in 1978, when I had barely passed 50. So my being in my late 40s and early 50s, I viewed life as a very chancy affair and viewed myself as just sort of being renting rather than being an owner of life. I felt temporarily on the planet, in short. And I couldn't foresee my later being blessed by the companionship with Janice Gaston. Janice is my muse for blueberries, for avian zen, and for so much more. And this is a picture of her and me when we were dressed up for joining the Christmas choir in the Methodist Church.
Let's take a minute and just tell me about the so much more, briefly.
So much more means that when we started on our first date by picking blueberries, it was a metaphor for a life of adventure outdoors, learning more about birds, and for learning to be inspired by the presence of another adult.
Moving ahead to our closing part of our time together, I want to express my gratitude for your being here with us today. Thank you. What are your hopes for your descendants?
It helps me to recall that my own generation's immediate ancestors survived, both as immigrants and tradespeople, farmers, and factory workers. It helps to remember that my generation has now survived World War II. It survived deep economic depressions, 2 of them, a war in Korea, a war in Vietnam, and in the Middle East, and in a number of lesser police actions. I regret to say that the tasks ahead loom even larger. I'm not optimistic about the threats for future atomic wars, for pandemics, for climate change, for societal and networking complete breakdowns. I do hope that you will have inherited a few and can learn to summon all of the countless physical and mental adaptabilities that you will surely need in order to endure and to prevail over the many disasters that are looming ahead of you.
Jim, any other advice for future generations?
Well, given the negative issues we've just spoken about for the foreseeable future, my first strong recommendation is for you to develop an enduring, regular meditative practice. and to stick with it no matter what happens. My second recommendation is to follow the wise leads that are outlined in this prayer by Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson was someone who knew much suffering in his own all too short 44-year-old life, and his verses run as follows. Give us grace and strength to forbear and to persevere. Give us courage and gaiety in the quiet mind. Spare to us our friends and soften to us our enemies. Give us the strength to encounter that which is to come, that we may be brave in peril, constant in tribulation, temperate in wrath, and in all changes of fortune, and down to the gates of death, loyal and loving to one another. Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you for watching June 2021 in Columbia, Missouri, a conversation with James H. Austin for StoryCorps on YouTube.
It wouldn't be in summer